Hi folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you for yet another Sunday session. Today's topic is the do's and don'ts of funding your developments through residential finance. Now, many of us very early in the journey tend to think that residential finance is the panacea of all funding, but there are a number of different ways to actually fund. And as you would have heard me hear about a number of times, we do no money down deals, we do commercial funding and the like. But if you are searching specifically residential funding for all of the benefits that come with the residential funding, then today's session is one not to be missed. We're going to tell you all of the tips and tricks and in how to actually get those applications across the line. Okay, so now typically what you're going to look at anytime you're looking for any funding of any description, you're going to be looking at the package as to what's actually sitting there. So you're going to be understanding how much you're borrowing, what your gearing is, who the lender is, the interest rates, whether or not the lender wants to do anything like pre-sales and things like that. But when you go down a very specific path and you're trying to look at residential funding, what you're trying to do is cram some of that stuff all the way down. Okay, so now in particular, let's compare residential finance against some of our alternatives like commercial funding. So if we have a look at the purpose of residential funding, it is for investment purposes, meaning that the banks are anticipating that you're going to be doing a long-term buy and hold somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 30 years when you're actually trying to purchase. And so the way they assess the deal is very, very different to someone in the commercial realm who might be looking at, a very, very short period of time, knowing that you're doing this for development purposes. Now, we're trying to convince that investment mindset from the bank to allow us to do our property development side of things. And sometimes that trips us up, okay? And so we need to understand what that is, why that is, and some of the things that they go looking for and the little trip hazards that we're going to find along the way, okay? So if we look a little more specifically, as I said, investment purposes, they're looking at specifically the serviceability. So your ability to actually fund the loan with either your own revenue stream, so how much money you're actually earning in your day job, or the rental return out of that property, or a combination of both, typically, okay? The interest is actually paid along the way. So they're assessing your ability to pay the loan every single month as we go. And the assumption is that the asset that you are purchasing is going to be retained in some way, shape or form, meaning that the house that's actually on the block is going to stay the house that's on the block. Now, if you compare that to commercial finance, they're looking at very, very different criteria. So they're looking at specifically development purposes. They actually understand that development has, a higher level of risk, but shorter timelines. And so they look at the deal specifically. They understand that cash flow for a developer is critical. So they look at capitalizing the interest and pushing it to the back end of the project and paid out of the sales of the finished product, okay? They're happier with much, much shorter timelines, and sometimes as small as just a couple of months, okay? And because they understand that you're doing a development, they're typically happy that the asset's going to be removed. Now, the problem that we tend to find is that we have commercial intent, but we're trying to fund it under residential purposes, and the two are in conflict with each other. And so if we say the wrong thing, if we do the wrong thing, and if we give, the bank too much information away, then the bank is going to go, hang on, I think that you're actually trying to do something that is not the intention of the loan purposes, and therefore we're not going to let that through. So let's have a look at the kinds of deals, if you were to get them across the line, that the bank would be happy with, and the criteria that would actually make them happy. Now, remember, they're looking at investment purposes. And so what they're willing to do is to say, well, from time to time, we'll let you develop on the assumption that you're going to long-term hold, okay? That is, you're going to hold the finished product for 20 or 30 years, but we're not going to do this for really, really big projects. We're only going to do it for really, really small projects. So they might do, for example, a simple 1:2 subdivision where you're constructing 2 brand new homes and you are anticipating keeping those 2 brand new homes and getting the rental return for those forever. They would similarly look at building 3 townhouses or less. As soon as you get to 4 townhouses, that tends to be the cusp where about half of the banks are going to say, no, that's commercial, and the other half are going to say, yeah, we can actually think of that as residential. Okay, but what they're going to look at is what is the serviceability of you able to keep that as finished product at the end. So your intention to buy and hold. Okay, so you need to have a very strong income stream and also a very strong rental return anticipated to come out of those projects so that you can, I guess, justify the ability to fund that along the way. Okay. Now, as I said, with residential lending, you are going to be paying the interest along the way. So if you're doing a project where you're going to have to do some construction funding and all that sort of thing, you're going to have to not only cash flow paying all of your consultants, but you're also going to have to cash flow the interest as you go. So cash flow wise, residential can be quite challenging. Where it's really enticing is the fact that it's much lower deposit. So you only need typically a 20% deposit. So what they call an 80% loan to value ratio, or LVR. And it's much, much lower interest rates. And that tends to be very, very attractive to some of us. If we look at the commercial path, they tend to want a little bit more deposit. So typically that's somewhere between 30 and 40% deposit, depending upon the size of the deal. The interest rate is a little bit higher because they actually anticipate the risk, but they capitalize the interest so you can pay at the tail end. So there's a lot of discrepancies and differences between the two. And so you need to look at your circumstances as to whether or not you want to go down the residential or the commercial path. For the purposes of today, I'm going to assume that you really want to go down that residential path. And so that's what we're going to look at to say, well, if you do, what are the trip hazards that you're going to come across? Okay. So firstly, there are 2 approaches that I tend to see people take. Okay. When they go and apply for the loans. Okay. Approach number 1 is the sneaky approach. Okay. And that is they only tell the bank what they need to know. Okay. So in other words, they don't disclose everything. Okay. Now I want to say fundamentally that this is very, very dangerous. Okay. It has the potential to trigger potential breaches against the loan and the potential for the bank to actually call the loan in. That said, I see many, many people in our community do this. And I see this across other communities as well. And so I'm going to cover the kinds of things that are going to be the trip hazards for you. Now, I don't condone the actions, but what I am going to do is inform you so that you can make your own decisions on your own behalf. Okay. As I said, this has the potential to backfire towards the end of the project, okay, and particularly when you're at peak debt, okay, and at the last minute they go, hang on, what are you doing? You never said you were going to be doing developments, and that can cause things to blow up, and they may force you to refinance at the tail end of it if you trigger a breach, and that can be quite costly when you're at peak debt. So that's approach number 1, the sneaky approach. Approach number 2, and by far the most recommended, is be upfront. Reveal everything about your intentions to develop. And in this instance, I'm going to say your broker is your best friend here, okay? It's important that you have 1000% full disclosure with your broker, okay? It is then up to the broker to then determine how much he reveals to the other side. Now, by being 1000% upfront with your broker, you are 100%. You're being 100% compliant with regards to, I guess, your disclosure. So you're not in breach or anything like that. Okay. Now, the thing is that the broker, and the reason why you use a broker is because if you go to a bank, the bank might have a single internal policy. You don't know, you don't have visibility of what that policy is, and you don't know how they're actually assessing the loan. And so you may get to a point where you trip up and not get your loan across the line because one of their internal policies doesn't allow what some of the things that you're actually trying to do. Now, the broker has visibility of many, many banks. They have visibility of all of their internal policies, and they'll know which banks will have which particular trip points and which ones to actually avoid. So they'll be able to eliminate probably 50% of the banks out there straight away, just knowing that they are not development-friendly banks. And they'll then be able to navigate the ones that are remaining, given the circumstances that you're actually going under. Now, as I said, legally, you have to have full disclosure, okay? So if you don't, that's the bank may deem that you've been deceptive and they can default on the loan. So really, really critical that you are up front on that, okay? Now, typically your broker will take the approach that when they apply for the loan, they will only answer the questions that the bank asks. Now, they are fully prepared to disclose if the bank asks, okay? Now, when they disclose, they have chosen a bank that those particular policies won't trip anything up. And so that's a good thing to know, that it's not going to cause any particular issues. But typically they will only do a need to know basis, okay? Now, this way you've met your legal obligations by fully disclosing, and you're not really privy to what the broker is actually telling the bank. So I guess there's a level of, separation between yourself and the bank, which means that you have plausible deniability if your broker doesn't reveal some of the things when that's next to be said. Now, let's have a look at assuming that you're actually going to apply for the loan. Typically, you're going to need a deposit, as I said, about a 20% loan to value ratio, and you're going to have to be proving your serviceability. Now, if you've sourced your deposit from investors, you need to be careful in how you actually, inform the bank that that's actually come about the case. Make sure that your broker actually knows exactly how you've sourced it, where you've sourced it, the fact that you've actually got investors in the process. And many banks are going to have standard terms with regards to the lodgement of second mortgages and things like that. So you want to be really careful that you don't trip over those. Now, I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in this as to how you deal with, protecting your investors and making sure that you're not tripping up the bank. But let's just put a little fishhook in that and come back to that one later on, okay? Now, from a serviceability point of view, remember the bank is looking for you to be able to prove that you can service this all the way. So they're going to look at both your serviceability and the revenue that's actually going to be generated from the finished product. Now, if you're going in with a money partner, then you want to be very careful that your money partner is the one that's actually revealed and you're not, because when they start to see them group together, that can cause some challenges, because they'll say, well, typically long-term buy and hold, you don't get two unrelated parties buying properties together unless there's some sort of cohesive or family unit. It's not always the case, but it certainly opens the door for questions to be asked, okay? So quite often what you'll do is you'll have the money partner on the loan, the money partner on the title, those sorts of things, and you'll be the equity partner running the deal. And that might be a side agreement that might sit to the side as an example. Now, pre-sales. Now, if you're going down a commercial path, many banks will actually ask for pre-sales in order to ensure the fact that you've got a, risk mitigation factor, that you are able to make sure that you can exit the deal. When you're doing residential finance, however, this is a huge no-no, okay? Because they are not expecting you to be pre-selling. So please, under all circumstances, don't tell them that you're going to be pre-selling. Because, as I said, they are looking for this to be a long-term hold. Now, how do you have a long-term hold when you've already sold one off the plan? A little bit tricky, okay? So because of that, make sure that whatever circumstances you're in, you're not in a position where pre-sales are a mandatory part of the mechanism, because that's going to automatically create some scrutiny. It's automatically going to, create some challenges in your process. Now, when you go to put the entity as to who is purchasing the property, so the entity and structure names, there can be a couple of challenges that you're going to trip over here. Now, I need to be very careful here that this is not legal, accounting, or financial advice or anything like that, okay? But remember that the bank is anticipating this to be long-term buy and hold, so there are certain flags that will trigger alarm bells within the bank that what you're doing is not long-term buy and hold. As an example, if you are silly enough to name your entity with something along the lines of developments, or developer or development or something along those lines, you're flagging pretty hard that you are a developer, okay? So please, whatever you do, make sure that the name of the entity that you're actually doing this in does not cause any alarm bells straight away, okay? That's might sound obvious, but it's amazing how many people just trip up on that one basic thing because they are so wrapped up in the fact that they are now into their first deal and they're now a developer. So they're going to put that, they're going to announce that to the world, and that will quite often actually trip them up. Okay. The next thing, and make sure you get accounting and legal advice here, is that there are certain entity types, entity structure types, that the institutions kind of associate with sophisticated development structures. As an example, a unit trust. Now, a unit trust is typically used on those more sophisticated development structures. And so if you use a unit trust, instantly that gives a little internal flag going, hang on, why would they be using this sophisticated development structure when what they're really trying to do is buy and hold? And so they'll start to ask a whole bunch of questions, okay? Now, equally, they may ask a couple of questions if you do this in a company name, although companies are much more common with regards to long-term buy and hold. It is a lot of people do that from a land banking perspective and things like that. Now, that might trigger some capital gains tax challenges with regards to if you were to doing that, but the bank is going to look through that and go, well, we're not really into your tax implications. That's not the bank's concern. So companies may ask some questions, but typically not as much. Unit trust will definitely create a whole bunch of questions being there. So make sure when you're going in with your entities that your names are, I guess, not reflecting, and that the entity types are going to be something that the bank is anticipating for that long-term buy and hold. Now, let's assume that you're going to be doing a development that involves potentially removing the existing house because you're trying to put some new townhouses, or maybe you're going to try and put 2 brand new homes or things like that. Okay. Now, if you need to demolish that house up front, you need to be very careful with the fact that the bank has anticipated that you've purchased a single property with a single house that was actually generating a rent up front. And so the moment you detonate that house and take it away, that's going to cause alarm bells, because all of a sudden you've taken away the security, and all of a sudden you've taken away the income source from that property. Okay, so if you were upfront with your bank, okay, then you're going to make sure that you've got all your development. So if you have told your bank, look, we're going to keep the finished product. Okay, if you've done that, then you're going to make sure that you've sought all the appropriate development approvals, that the bank has signed off the demolition prior to pulling your trigger, that you've got all your construction ready to go, that you've got all your construction finance ready to go. Because what they don't want to do is they don't want to see that house go down, the revenue stream drop, and then nothing come out of the ground straight away. They're going to be concerned that that's going to cause some challenges with regards to your ability to service the loan. Okay, so they'll want to see that your building approvals in place, and that you've got a builder lined up, and that it's, house comes down one day and the next day something goes up. So that was if you're up front. Now, if you were not up front, if you took that sneaky approach, now remember, the bank is going to assume that the house is going to be retained. So the house is an asset, the house is earning income. So if you knock it down, that's going to cause your bank considerable concern. And that one of the reasons why I said before, you really, really, really need to have that full disclosure. Okay, so if you do that, the bank may not get visibility of it straight away, but if and when they do get visibility, that is almost certainly going to be causing a breach. And so it's important that that you understand that you're prepared for that. And if you get that breach, you have an ability to actually pay out the loan very, very quick smart, because they're going to call that in as quick as you can imagine. Okay. The next thing, if you're going to be purchasing, I guess when you're purchasing the property in the first place, many of us want to put a whole bunch of special conditions into the purchase contract in order to protect our rights as a developer, to make sure that we can get all the things that we want across the line. So one of the most common ones, okay, is due diligence. Now, can you imagine a bank anticipating a long-term buy and hold, and then you have a due diligence clause in there? That's going to cause them concerns again. Okay, so there's a number of other special conditions that as soon as they see these terms, as soon as they see these reference points, because the bank gets a copy of that contract up front, as soon as they see that, they're going to start to ask questions. So due diligence is one of them. The ability to lodge a development approval prior to settlement, that is another one that's going to cause the bank a whole bunch of concerns, because clearly you've said that you want development approval. If you're doing a joint venture with the landowner, or if you're doing profit split or performance bonuses with the landowner, things like that, and you've got that built into your special conditions, that's instantly going to start to cause some alarm bells. Okay, so make sure that if you are buying under residential finance, that you have done all of your due diligence before signing the contract, and that when you go into signing the contract, you are 100% confident that that deal is actually going to go ahead, and that you've had all the appropriate expertise that have given you the advice to say that deal is a no-brainer, and you've got minimal to no risk in actually taking that on. Okay. If you keep those due diligence clauses in there, and if you keep the subject to development approval, then you are asking for trouble with the bank to review that, unless you have been upfront with them in the first place to say that you're going to be keeping the finished stock. Okay, so make sure you're upfront. Okay, very, very clear on that. Now, another one, and this might seem a little bit obvious to most of us, but as we go through the development cycle, in most instances, we're going to be removing that existing house, which is going to leave a vacant block of land. Now, sometimes it's an entire vacant block of land. Sometimes we create a vacant block to the rear of the existing house. But either way, we have a vacant block of land that is going to be created even if it's going to be just temporary. It's going to be sitting there for a little while, then we're going to build something on it. Okay. Now, it is surprising how many banks have on the internal policies that they do not allow vacant land to be held as security for their mortgage. And the reason for that is because vacant land doesn't actually generate any revenue. And so I guess during that period, the bank is concerned that you have no income stream coming in, you have no ability to actually service the loan. And so there are going to be many banks that won't allow that to occur. Now, this one I have been personally caught out by, okay, going back many, 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 many years. I had a JV partner who was actually a loan broker. And so they went and got the loan. They went and checked all the internal policies, and they were not aware of the fact that that vacant land clause was actually sitting in there. And so towards the tail end of the project, when we created the vacant block of land, all of a sudden it caused an issue, and the bank said, well, we're not going to actually allow that to occur. We are not going to let you proceed any further. You have to refinance the loan. And this was towards the back end of the project, whereas at peak debt. Now, I put every faith and every trust in the fact that my JV partner was a loan broker, that they knew what they were doing in looking at those internal policies. And so I have since learned that that one is a major headache. So be very careful. If at any stage during the project you're going to have vacant land, then make sure that the internal policy that your broker has checked that vacant land can actually be kept as security. Okay. Now, and the reason for that, okay, sorry, let me rephrase that. So the step before creating that, typically when you're going to create either townhouses, strata titles, duplexes, apartments, that sort of thing, one of the things that you're going to do is you're actually going to do a subdivision. Okay. Now there's all sorts of subdivisions. There's Torrens title subdivisions, there's strata subdivisions, there's a whole bunch of things like that. Either way, the subdivision process effectively goes to the process of tearing up the original contract, the original title, I should say, and then reinstates that with a alternative title or alternative titles. So if you're creating a 6-pack of townhouses, then you would tear up the first title and you would put 6 brand new titles in place. Now that process actually causes an event to occur with the titles office, where the titles office has a look at the original title and says, hey, there's a mortgage sitting on here. We need to go to the bank and get the bank to approve the fact that that title can actually be torn up and reinstated. Okay, and that is called general consent. Okay, so the bank needs to give general consent in order for that title to be done. And they will momentarily remove the mortgage from the old one. They will create the 6 brand new ones and they'll put the new mortgage over the top of the old one. Now, that general consent process, you need to make sure that your bank is going to be development friendly and actually allow that to occur. Again, That's one of the reasons why we want full disclosure up front, okay? To make sure that the broker has actually disclosed to the bank, I guess, what is going to happen, the whole mechanism that's going to sit there. And we don't want, because otherwise this is pretty much the last step before you get titles. At this point, you have incurred maximum debt. You're at peak debt. So you've got debt out to your eyeballs and you can't sell the finished product unless you get those titles. And so this can hold you up for ages, okay? And can be, again, another trigger point for the bank to go, whoa, if you didn't disclose that up front, you're actually in breach of the loan. Again, go and refinance that out, okay? So be very, very careful of that one. Now, to obtain the general consent, that process itself takes time, okay? So when you're approaching the point where you're going to need the titles created, one of the prerequisite steps is a thing called plan sealing. Plan sealing is where you get the original development approval conditions. You put a report together and send that to the council and says, hey, council, you said I could do this if I met all these conditions. Here is a report that says how I've met those conditions. Can you please sign off on that and seal the plan to say that, yes, we can. Now, a seal used to be the old wax seal that they used to melt and put in. So that's why it's called plan sealing. When they have that and they have the general consent, then and only then will the titles office remove the old title and create a brand spanking new one. So you need to make sure that you take those sealed plans to the bank and say, hey, we've met all of our conditions now. The council has approved that. Can you now please give that final consent? Now that internal process can take a couple of months. So make sure that you are pre-preparing the bank that is coming through and the like. Now, in going and getting your loan at the very, very start, one of the things that the bank is most likely to do is send in a valuer. Now, valuers are going to be assessing the process, make sure that the property is actually worth what you have said it's worth. And so one of the things that the valuers are going to do is they're going to go and start doing a whole bunch of searches because they want to find out what the, I guess, the highest and best use for the property is. So they're going to see, well, what's it worth in its existing condition? Are there any development approvals in place? All those sorts of things. So they do a whole bunch of searches to come back and then report back to the bank to say, okay, we can see that in this particular instance, the property is in this condition, and therefore we think that it's worth X, okay? Now, part of that process, as I said, is that they are seeking or they are searching for to see if any development approvals actually exist. Now, because of that, okay, they are almost certainly going to find any pre-existing development approvals from before you bought the property, or any development application that you may have lodged prior to actually taking settlement. Because one of the things that in the special conditions you may have asked for is the ability to lodge those applications prior to settlement. So if you didn't actually get caught out on the fact that it was written into the special conditions, you will probably be caught out by the fact that the valuer has done the search and actually seen that development approval in place. Okay, so if you're going to be doing that, okay, and if you have not had full disclosure, then please do not lodge your application prior to settlement, because if you do, it is almost certain that the valuer is actually going to find that and they will call that out to the bank. Okay, so that can cause a whole bunch of mayhem. I have seen several people in our community that have lodged applications very early. That has triggered an alert, and they've had a please explain conversation with their bank because they weren't upfront in the first place. Again, be upfront, folks, okay? Now, I touched on before, many of us coming into this process, we're going to be doing this with investors who might be trying to, I guess, give us some funds in order to service the loan, or come up with the liquid cash to run the deal, or maybe come up with the deposit in order to purchase. And so those investors coming in many instances, those investors are going to want to protect their investment, okay? Now, the most common ways to protect their investment is either a second mortgage or a caveat, okay? Now, if that's the case, almost every bank has a standard condition in their clause that says that no additional security can be placed against the property, and that if you do, this can constitute a breach of the loan, okay? Now, that can be very, very scary to read, absolutely, okay? But understand that their ability to actually enforce that clause varies from state to state, okay? And in some instances, depending upon the state they're in, their bark is worse than their bite. So what it says in the condition may not be enforceable in that particular state. Now, remember, most banks are national, so they will write the same bank loan documents to work nationally, okay? And so they're not going to vary from state to state, the conditions of their contracts. Now, that said, you want to be very, very, very careful that you don't just assume that you're in one of those states that, that they can't actually enforce that right. Now, be very careful here, okay? Don't do anything without first seeking legal advice. Make sure that the advice, they understand the jurisdiction that you're doing it in. They have read, the solicitor has read the bank's specific policies, and they understand your specific circumstances with regards to what your investors are trying to do. If that's the case, what you may find, and I say may, okay, what you may find is that they can't actually stop you from lodging the mortgage, and they may not be able to stop you from lodging a caveat either. Now, that said, there are going to be instances where they can stop you. You do need their approval, and so you will need to disclose. So make sure that you understand which particular jurisdiction you are in. Now, if you're in a jurisdiction where it's not allowed, then you want to start to talk to your solicitor and very carefully consider whether or not the security, the second mortgage, whether or not that is registered, which means that it's physically lodged, or whether or not it's just physically signed and might sit in the top drawer of your investors just in case they need it at some point in the future. Now, I can't give you advice on that. What I can say is be careful of that and make sure you speak to your solicitor in that approach. Now, if you are wanting to know whether or not that is the case, I found a document that would be very handy for you guys to go and research by a soliciting firm called Bennett and Philp. So that is Bennett, B-E-N-N-E-T-T, and Philp, P-H-I-L-P. And they talk about whether or not a second mortgage and a caveat, what is and is not allowed in each individual state. Now, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this. I am not a solicitor, okay? But in going to refuse that, in going to review that, it was surprising that there was only 1 or 2 states that actually had the ability to refuse. Now, most states can't refuse, but what they can do is they can actually say, look, we need to have a deed of priority. We need to make sure that we are in front of your loan, that sort of thing. So make sure that you actually go and check it. Now, I'm not going to read out which states are what, because that potentially might make me liable, and I don't know when this video is actually going to be reviewed, and so situation may change between there and now. But go and look that up, use that as reference to go talk to your solicitor, make sure that document is actually up to date, okay? What I can say is in looking through that, there was only 1 or 2 states where they can actually genuinely refuse. Now, in most instances though, even though they could refuse, you have the ability to go out and request, can I please lodge this second mortgage? In which case they would actually put a deed of priority, which means that they are in front of the second mortgage anyway, but that kind of discloses your hand, the fact that you actually have those investors there. So again, that will potentially cause some headaches. Now, all of that together, okay, now what we want to do is make sure before we actually get our deal, we actually want to get ourselves to the point where we are deal ready, okay? Now, when I mean by deal ready, we actually want to make sure that we've done all the work necessary so that when we actually go and apply for finance, that it makes the process as streamlined as humanly possible, okay? So we need to make sure that we are organized with all of our tax returns. We need to make sure that we've got all of our assets and liabilities and those sorts of things handy and able to be called on notice, okay? We need to understand our serviceability, our equity, our liquid position, okay? If we need investors, we need to make sure that we go and assess our investors for the same thing. We need to make sure that they've done their tax returns, that they've done their assets and liabilities, and that we have vetted them appropriately to make sure that when they actually do the application, that they are actually going to get across the line, okay? Now, all of that takes time. So when I say get ready, sometimes it will take you weeks or sometimes even months to prepare your tax return for the previous year. Or you might find that your JV partner has not done that for several years. So they may have a whole bunch of backlog that they actually all of a sudden have to catch up with. That takes time. Now, the bank also takes time to do their application process, but they can't actually assess the application if you haven't lodged the appropriate documents. So make sure you make your life easy by giving them the maximum amount of time by you getting yourself ready for the deal, okay? Now, in doing that, what you're going to do is you're going to present to the bank and via your broker, you're going to present to them what is called an information memorandum. Now, we've dealt with information memorandums in the past, and I've spoken about the fact that you might need an information memorandum to get your investors on board. You want to show them that this is actually a good deal, all that sort of thing, okay? And so that version of IM is going to be very, very different to the one that you actually present the bank, okay? So let's talk that through, okay? So you want a very specific IM that is bank friendly. Remember that the bank is looking for a different outcome to what your investors are, so different information going in there. So an investor might want to know things like the development budget, the cash flow, how and where you're going to get development approvals, what the demographics of the area are, what your exit strategies, known issues, those sorts of things. They might want a valuation report, a marketing plan. They want to know your experience, all that sort of thing, okay? Now, if you take all of that and you give that to the bank, again, you're declaring your hand to say, hey, we're doing developments here. Now, if you've been up front, that's okay. But if you haven't, that's going to cause a whole bunch of pain. So instead, you might give them a slightly different version, and that might be with some minimal information. So, hey bank, here is some market comparables. Here are the demographics as to what we're actually expecting. Here's the rental appraisals for the area. That might be through a valuer or might be through an agent. This is the long-term capital growth for the area, plus here are my financials. So it's a much shorter, much more compressed document that helps you through and simplifies the process for the bank. So there you have it, folks. There are some of the do's and don'ts of how to get yourself residential finance. Now, I'm going to go out to the audience in a moment to go and take some questions. But before I do, just going to let you know that we run these Sunday sessions most weekends. And so if you have missed any back catalogs, we have those archived out to YouTube. So make sure you go to YouTube, search for Property Developer Network, and you will find us on there. And you can go and watch all of the back shows that we've had in the past. Also let you know that we run meetups in 3 states. So we run these in New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. So if you are interested in coming, hearing from industry experts, hearing from other people in our community sharing real deals, doing some masterminding where we can help you with your projects and pushing forward or your journey, and then also socializing afterwards, then please make sure you come to one of our monthly meetups in those 3 states, New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. We also run a couple of Facebook communities. So there is Property Developer Network, and there is also development site Deal Hub. Now, Property Developer Network is where you can engage with your peers, ask them for assistance, and the community will try and help you out. Development site Deal Hub is a place where you can find off-market deals and off-market transactions, okay? And lastly, we actually do have an education program that many people ask me about as well. It's called Property Development Formula. If you are interested in that at all, then you go to propdev.info/PDF, short for Property Development Formula, and you can read all about it. So that said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to Facebook land and see how many questions we've got coming through. So give me half a sec while I just bring that up. And okay, so see who is online and what questions we've got. 2 seconds, folks. Over to Facebook. Okay, I'm seeing lots of people. Okay, so Felicity says, given that in Victoria, the normal process is to put in your signed offer up front and then the bits of due diligence that cost money, do you have any ideas of an alternative to a due diligence clause that won't make banks suspicious? That's an interesting one, Felicity. So you have to make sure that you're very clear on the fact that these residential type projects should be very simple in nature, okay? I don't want you going and overcomplicating the kind of projects that you're putting through these smaller projects, these smaller funding models. One of the things that you can do, every single contract has a number of predetermined clauses that actually sit in there. So one of them is a subject to finance clause. One of them is a building and pest clause, things like that. So there may be an opportunity that you can use those to actually justify the ability to get out of the contract if you think your due diligence is not being able to service. That's not legal advice. That's just what I've seen other people actually do and is a mechanism that is available. In most states, you also have a cooling off period that is available to you as well, but that tends to be quite short. Typically, that's less than 5 days from the day you've actually signed the contract. So those are available. That said, make sure you've done your due diligence before you sign the contract. I said that right at the very start because of the fact that you don't want that due diligence clause in there. What I do know is that in states like Victoria, it takes time to draw up the contract. It takes time to prepare the contract, and you have a full disclosure in the contract. And so a lot of that is your due diligence, okay? So you've got plenty of opportunity to actually review that before signing it because everything has been disclosed. So they're going to disclose things like, I guess, what zoning you've got, what overlays there are, any easements that might sit there, and a whole bunch more. So that is part of your Section 32 in Victoria. So you've got that to review before you sign. Now, Brian says, Rob, with the IM to the lender, do you show your forecast FISO finance costs or not? So Brian, subject to, did you have full disclosure up front? If you had full disclosure up front, then absolutely you would forecast to them that you have got profit in the deal, but make sure you don't refer to it as the word profit because that infers the fact that you are selling, but rather equity, okay? So you have built soft equity in the deal rather than profit, okay? So yes, absolutely. Now, if you have not been upfront with your bank, if you show them a feasibility, again, that's going to be a cause for alarm, okay? So some of the things that I've been talking about today are all about whether or not you have done that sneaky approach, okay? Now, I did say I don't condone it, and I'll say it again, I don't condone being sneaky to your bank, but I do know that many of you do it, hence why this topic today, just to know where are the trip hazards, okay? Now, Ginu has said, is there a limit of costs involved for getting resi loan for development? Typically not costs, Ginu. It's typically the deal size, the number of dwellings. So the common residential number is 3. So if you are doing less than 3, you can typically get that as a residential loan. If you do 4, then the number of banks that will actually give you that residential lending tend to drop off quite significantly. You will get some banks that will actually do that, but most of them won't. So 4 is definitely the cutoff point. 3, you'll pretty much get most of them. But remember though, you're going to have to prove the ability that you can actually service that with the finished product at the end, okay? Okay, what else have we got? So Dale says, trying to use res lending for a subdivision creating vacant land, what's the largest project that will get through? Townhouse projects are easier to get finance for. So 2 different questions there. So again, Dale, this is pretty much the same question that I just answered for Ginu. So 3 is the easy number. 4 is the, I guess, the cutoff point. Now, remember though, that you might do this in a 2-stage process, and this is probably worthwhile actually knowing. You might purchase the property under residential finance because at this point, it is a raw site. There is no development on there. Whilst it's in that space, you might go and get your development approval. Once you've got the development approval, you might refinance that out into commercial. So that is possible. Now, if you're going to do that, there is no limit on the maximum that you actually go to, but remember, you are financing out. So you're not taking the residential finance all the way through to the end, okay? So the whole premise of this conversation was the fact that you're taking the resi all the way through to the end. So, but know that that is a valid approach as well. Karen says, If you tell the bank you are buy, develop, and then hold, will that raise red flags? Karen, only if you can't service the loan at the end. Okay, so they're going to look at the revenue stream that comes from the finished product. They're going to ask you to do rental appraisals on the finished product, either through a valuer or through an agent. And they're going to look at the serviceability of that. So long as you've been upfront with that, and so long as it is less than those 3 that I was talking about, then there shouldn't be a problem if you are upfront. Okay, please don't be sneaky on that. Yeah, please don't be sneaky on that. Teresa says, is there an upper value for the maximum amount a bank? Sorry, hang on. That's just scrolled very quick. Let me try that again. Is there an upper amount of value the bank might lend you under residential construction loan project, i.e. 2 to 3 townhouse developments would cost far more, etc. In different towns? No, it's not typically the value. It's typically the number of dwellings. Okay, they're only really going to care about your ability to service the debt at the end. So whether or not they lend you 2 million or whether or not they lend you 20 million depends on whether or not you can actually pay for that at the end. So it's not the amount that you're borrowing, it's typically the number of dwellings and the ability for you to actually service that. Okay, keep it under 3, you shouldn't have a problem. If you are at 4, you're going to have to shop around, but I guess again, look at that income stream of the finished product. Karen says, is it Resi Finance on to build or straight to commercial at 1.7 million buy-in? These are all valid questions, guys, but the answer is pretty much the same. It's not about the purchase price. It's not about the cost of the construction. It's about the number of dwellings that you've got there, and it's about whether or not you can actually service that. So very good questions, but the answer typically is the same. Teresa then says, is there a historical register that banks will search for directors associated with companies to identify a red flag that you are a developer? Teresa, each bank tends to have an internal register. Absolutely. Now, they tend to not share that between banks unless, of course, that bank owns a number of subsidiaries. Okay, so for example, Westpac owns St. George Bank. Commonwealth Bank owns Bank West. Okay, so if you are within one of the subsidiaries, they might share that within that subsidiary range. Okay, but they typically, Commonwealth Bank wouldn't share it with Westpac, and Westpac wouldn't share it with Commonwealth, for example. Okay, so yes, there are internal registers. So if you trip a red flag, then you may have to stay away from that particular bank for the next time through. Okay. Okay, that appears to be the last of the questions, folks. So thank you. Hope you got plenty out of that. I guess in summary, my recommendation, folks, always make sure that you have full disclosure. And in all instances, make sure you also go through a broker where you've got that full disclosure, and you disclose to your broker what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, and what your particular exit strategy is. The broker will then help you to navigate through the process. Okay, be aware of little gotchas like the name of the entity that you're putting it in and things like that, because they're just instantly going to cause red flags. Make sure that if you've had full disclosure, it doesn't really matter if you've got things like due diligence and subject to development approval in your condition. If you have not had full disclosure, all of those are going to be red flags. Okay, so just know that that's the case and that they will actually be looking for you. Other than that, folks, hope you've got plenty out of it. And if you come and join us at our next meetup, we run those in 3 states around the country, as I said, and growing. And otherwise, I will see you for our next Sunday session next Sunday at 5 o'clock. Bye for now. Oh, trying to find the exit button. Okay, bye.